Okay, welcome back everybody. We're all here phoned up and online. This last session, or not quite the last session, but this session is about using the atlas within the context of local history. And there are two speakers, Brendan Omalley and Elizabeth Shotton. Now you're not here to hear me, so let's throw ourselves straight in. Our first speaker is going to be Brendan Omalley. Now Brendan spent most of his career in electronics, computer and the software industries, working in a whole range of companies, ending up for his sins in the University of Limerick. Fortunately for us that is, he has retired from the University of Limerick and he has spent his time working on family history and genealogy ever since, particularly the Omalley clan. And what he's going to talk about today is his investigation into the history of the Roundhouse in Limerick, that he has published some material about it in the North Munster Journal, and I'm sure you're going to hear new and exciting revelations this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to everybody for inviting me along this evening to tell you about my project, which concerns an unusual building in Limerick called the Roundhouse. It's unusual in its shape. It's semicircular, 3 stories over basement, and as you can see on the picture, there are streets down both sides of it, so it stands at the end of a small plot of land that I'll refer to a couple of times in the course of this. Now it's an interesting historical project, but when I was growing up, this was where my father worked. He had a wine and spirit business that had been in the family, and it was where I would go if I was in town and I needed a lift home at the end of the afternoon. Nothing very special. But in 2014, a cousin, Grace O'Malley Cantillon, published a book called The Roundhouse O'Malleys, which was a family history of the O'Malleys who had come into that business, originally my great-grandfather, and his children, and how all of that happened. And that's a picture of her with Des O'Malley launching the book, as I say, back in 2014. The take that she took on it, which was an interesting one, was about a woman called Kate Fleming, who married one Michael Omalley, a small farmer in County Limerick on 26 acres, who had 8 children and determined that being a farmer's wife on 26 acres in the 1840s and 50s was not the life that she wanted for her children, and how she set about educating them and finding roles for them that would get them away from that sort of life. Interestingly, all the girls became nuns. That was seen as vastly superior to being a farmer's wife, and the boys did various different things. One branch of the family became the sort of Limerick political O'Malleys, of which Des is one, and others in various places in Australia and Malaya and various sorts of parts of the world. But one of the things that Grace never managed to determine was when the building itself had actually been built. And I said I'd have a go at figuring that out. And I came across the Historic Towns Atlas. And I've always loved maps. As a kid, I would tend to put maps up on my bedroom wall where other people would put up pop stars and things. I like to put up maps. And I was attracted to the collection of historic maps in it. So I started to look, and this shows in the picture there the city walls of Limerick just coming up sort of diagonally across, ran across the front of the corn market, and where it says Mungret Gate, there was a gate in the original city walls. So this, as you can see, this long lozenge shape plot of land in the middle was where the Roundhouse is at one end of that, at the further end from the city walls. But the redrawn map, as you see it there, the map 2 that people have been referring to, which was a reproduction of Limerick of 1840, It's not entirely clear whether that's a rectangular end or a round end. So I had to go further afield to try and find evidence of when it was built. And I found in the National Archives the Ordnance Survey manuscript maps, which are in large scale, even though the published ones are on a smaller scale. And that is quite clear. Around 1840, that building was not there. That was a rectangular end, two buildings together, whereas in the 1897 map, it quite clearly is. So somewhere in that period, the building was built. So my next, I went further back then to try and establish the history of the land itself. And this land is on a townland called Pryors land. And as you could imagine, that meant it belonged to the Augustinian Priory of Holy Cross. And at the time of the Reformation, when the monasteries were dissolved, that was given to a pal of Thomas Cromwell, who was mayor of Limerick at the time, by the name of Edmund Sexton. The map that I show here is from the Down survey conducted by the Cromwellians, and this was 1657, to establish who got to hang on to, who occupied land, who got to hang on to it, and who was turfed out to make room for Cromwell's allies. But at that point, it was still owned by one Christopher Sexton, who got to hang on to it as a royalist, who was in with the crown, or with the Cromwellians, I should say, and subsequently inherited by a man called Edmund Sexton Perry, Mayor of Limerick, MP for Limerick, and who used it to develop what's now Newtown Perry. If you look at the map there, you'll see two sections. English Town, which was the historical older part of Limerick, Irish Town, linked by a bridge, and this plot of land that I talk about was just outside Mungret Gate, which is just here, this gate on the map. If you look at the yellow colouring, which is on the original map, you'll notice a little blip outside the gate, a little triangular shape in the line. What was interesting is Lord Limerick, who was the descendant of the Perry family and owned all of this land, sold his ground rents in 1907. And the land was divided up into lots, and there was one lot on one side of that little triangle and another lot on the other side, and the triangle itself, even though in 1907 there were a number of buildings on it, was not part of the sale. And it seemed very strange to me. So the explanation, it seems, is again coming from the atlas, these two maps, and the description there is that in 1643 defences were built. You can see this is a different orientation to the previous map, but where the circles are, you can see in 1690 and still there in 1752, elaborate fortifications built at the gate, defensive fortifications. And in 1752, the later map, you can see the wall is still there, the gate is still there, and the outlines of the fortifications are there. But in that little triangle, or in the middle, the plot of land I'm talking about, there are the beginnings of development. There are houses, there are fields, it's divided into plots. So people are living there at this stage. One of the things I also had to go on was this box that I inherited from my father, which had various leases and documents and old wills and things like that I hadn't ever really looked at before, but this gave me a context to do it. And essentially what they tell us is that the oldest reference was a fellow called William Osborne, who was a clothier, and he leased the Roundhouse end of that plot to his son in 1802, referring to the hornworks outside Mungret Gate. And as you can read in the atlas, a hornwork was a technical term for a defensive fortification. So that confirms that it was that piece. But it seems like Osborne had leases from Lord Limerick for properties along the other side of the street, but somehow he got hold of what would have been common land. That's the land under these ramparts that have been built outside the gate. As squatters moved onto it, somehow he got control of it and subsequently leased it onwards. That lease was renewed in 1847 to a man called John Fogarty, who has He and his family were engineers, builders, architects, and several of the surviving significant buildings in Limerick today were built by the Fogarty family. Then I found a terrific resource online in the trade directories in Limerick, which showed who occupied various sites and who they held their land from. And that showed that one Margaret Kirby ran a pub and grocery on the site from the mid-40s through into the mid-60s. And that's confirmed in the Griffiths valuation records as well. So the Fogartys owned it and leased it to Margaret Kirby. The son, John Fogarty's son, Joseph, married in 1865, and the property was transferred to a trust in the name of his wife and children. He got married in, as I say, in 1865. And the next lease was to a man called John Hayes in 1868. And he made a will in 1870, which gave his address as the Roundhouse. So in 1870, the building was there. And I would think that the transfer from Margaret Kirby's occupation for some 20 years or so, or at least 20 years, to Hayes was the occasion when the Fogartys decided to build this new building, and the lease to Hayes was at a much higher rent than she had been paying, which fits in with the notion of a new building as well. So the conclusion that I came to was that the building was built 67, 68 by the Fogartys, and with the idea that this would be there as security to the Cochrane family, which was his new wife and future children. The Omalley connection with this is that Hayes hired as an apprentice one Thomas Omalley, who came in from the countryside, pushed in by his mother. He was apprenticed in 1868 when Hayes started in the pub, but Hayes died no more than 3 years later of TB in his mid-40s, and left his entire estate to young Thomas, which was quite a windfall. Thomas then got married to a woman called Annie O'Mara from Tipperary, but he died himself a year later, a very young man, supposedly from a chill. Perhaps it was TB. They all lived over the shop, so he would have been in the same premises as Hayes. Maybe that's what he died of. But anyway, there were a standoff between the family of the young widow and the O'Malleys. So the O'Malleys were upstairs with the corpse, and the O'Maras were downstairs blocking entry and exit to the building. And this document was dated 3 days after he died, and the O'Malleys paid £350 to buy out the interests of the O'Maras in the business and continue on. I still have that at home. And then over the years, Patrick was put in there, a brother of Thomas, to run the business. He died in 1910. His brother Joe ran it for a bit, and then Patrick's son, my grandfather, took it over, my father, and it was returned to being a pub in the mid-70s and renamed Mother Mac's, which is what it would be today. So if you happen to be in Limerick, Mother Mac's sports a fine selection of real ales and various brands of whiskey, so I could recommend a visit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Masterpiece of timekeeping and of synthesis of all those themes that we've heard about already, between the evolution of the built heritage, genealogy, local history, and the elements which go to synthesize into one entry in the Atlas. Now we're going to move on to Elizabeth Shotton's paper, and they will take questions at the end. Elizabeth is an architect who teaches in the UCD School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy, and she's particularly interested in sustainable building and development. She has a background in commerce and architecture and a PhD in architecture from UCD. Her research interests are very closely linked to her teaching, with a focus on sustainable use of material resources through advances in materials, construction technologies and design process. And since 2015, she's been involved in a very exciting area, I think anyway, where she's been leading a study on Ireland's minor harbours, examining the evolution of maritime engineering in small piers and quays along the coast of Ireland from the 17th century to the present. And she's currently trying to put that into a context with a current collaboration with Cardiff University on Harbour View, extending the research through the investigation of similarities and differences between Welsh and Irish harbours, and engaging with local communities on documenting their own piers and quays. Elizabeth.
Thank you. I should make clear, if that wasn't clear, that my interest is not actually in towns, it's on quays and piers. And I only look at the town in as much as it tells me something about the quay or pier. So sort of the inverse to the town atlas. And I'm going to take you on a very quick journey through my very non-linear and often circular reasoning process that I go through when I try to work out what's going on with the harbour. In particular, I looked at Carrick Ferguson in this study. But I'm not going to start with Carrick Ferguson, I'm going to start with Newhaven. In 2007, Carl Brady from National Monuments and some of his colleagues came across this ruin of a pier in Newhaven, which is just up the coast from Balbriggan, and described it in great detail. And how he described this ruin was that it was made up of small and large, roughly hewn boulders, particularly the outside, which was 3 dry stone courses of undressed large boulders, and it was packed on the interior with smaller stone and pebbles and sand. And what he describes is what I drew, a double stone wall with interior packing. That's a pretty traditional way of making a stone pier from a certain period. He then goes on to say that the pier was built in 1562 by James Barnwell, and based on the Downs survey image of the Newhaven harbour with its vertical line work, he suggests that it was encased in vertical wooden timbers or piles, even though he didn't find any timber on the site. And he concludes by saying this would have been not too dissimilar to the pier on the 1560 map of Carrick Ferguson held in the British Library. Now, for me, I have much admiration for Carl Brady and his work, and I appreciate why he would think it would be timber because of that line work, but in fact, that drawing is about that big. His description of how it's built suggests to me a double stone wall, and a double stone wall would not need those timbers. So I'm very interested in Carrick Ferguson now, which is how I get to the town atlas. Because in 2010, when I read this, I couldn't get to the British Library to look at that map, but I knew there was a town atlas on Carrick Ferguson. And here is that map. I've neatly cut out the towns so that we can look at the thing I'm interested in. And this is not the copy from your town atlas, this is a copy from the British Library. So we have the color. But what's important to note here, it is a timber structure, and breakwaters like this, there's a variety of different ways of building them in timber. This is one way with wooden stakes. They're certainly infilled with stone, but it's rubble stone. It's not a parallel set of walls that are then infilled again. This is rubble stone inside a pair of parallel timber walls. And what's most important is there are horizontal members tying those timber walls together. And that has to be there, regardless of how you build the timber, because otherwise the stone would just push the timber out. So all timber harbors have those horizontal pieces in them in some way. And even if the timber had rotted out at Newhaven, there would have been a mark where that timber would have been. So now I'm wondering about Carrick Fergus and wondering more about Newhaven. So then I actually read the town atlas, and I figure out that Carrick Fergus is an Anglo-Irish colony, that it's embattled, that it doesn't talk to its neighbours, because they're all ferocious Irishmen, and it only talks to people via sea routes, particularly to the Pale, the Dublin Pale. That it received a new charter in 1569, and for me, as a harbour enthusiast, that sometime before 1685, it had a pond that was used to sluice water and rid the harbour basin of silt. This is a technology that is known, not widely used. Ostend in Belgium had a sluice like this at the time as noteworthy, and engineers remark on it because it's noteworthy. The other harbour that has something like that is Dover, actually, at the same time. This is an image of Dover from 1538, and it too had timber construction, different type of timber construction, but timber constructed breakwaters filled with stone. And it also had, as of 1576, a pent-in sluice that would help to sluice the silt away from the harbour. Didn't do a very good job, as it happens, but so this is a very equivalent harbour to Carrick Fergus at this point. And now I'm thinking, I've left Newhaven behind, and I'm wondering if there's a relationship between Carrick Fergus and Dover. And part of the reason I'm wondering that is because how they both evolve. So this is actually where I really go to in the Irish Town Atlas. The first place I go to before the text and the maps is the Gazetteer, is all those lists of things that you know about the quay, because I want to know what you know about the quay. And I also want to know where the information comes from so that I can go and look at the information myself in the original. And there are a variety of dates for the rebuilding of Carrick Fergus Quay, which is mapped here by Thomas Phillips in 1690. But the most authoritative source says it was started in 1627. Now that's interesting to me because 1627 is just a couple of decades later than Dover is rebuilt. And I should have probably showed you at the beginning this slide is one of the big questions for me in my research and my current working hypothesis. The question is, how does technological knowledge of how to build a pier get transferred around the place before we have surveyors and later engineers? And we certainly have neither in the 16th century. And the hypothesis is it's either formally through the movement of craftsmen or through the owning of estates in different districts, or it's informally through the coasting trade. And there's a lot of coasting trade for hundreds of years in the Irish Sea, either for trade or for fishing. So the knowledge could be moving informally in those routes. And the reason I'm thinking of Dover now is because I've read up on Dover quite a lot before I got to Carrick Fergus. So I know from the town atlas, Carrick Fergus is embattled, doesn't talk to its neighbours. So when it decides to rebuild its pier in stone, it's not getting the idea from its neighbour. It's getting its ideas from somewhere else. I know that Carrick Fergus is now governed by a prominent Englishman, Arthur Chichester. And I also know from another source, Ash, who wrote about the rebuilding of Dover Harbour, that Queen Elizabeth is very anxiously at this time trying to collect up power to London so that any management of technologically challenging projects is now being handled centrally in London. And this is made manifest in Ash's study of the rebuilding of Dover Harbour in the late 16th century. So now I'm wondering, is the link here about governance, about Carrick Ferguson can really only talk to Dublin or the Dublin Pale, and Newhaven is in the Dublin Pale, or Dover. So then I look at Dover. Two good sources on Dover are Minette and Ash. Neither of them, both of them authorities on Dover. Neither of them talk about construction at all. So I have to sort of pull the construction out. In that little circle up there, you can see the original pier, which is obviously timber stakes. In the big circle down there, above Dover, is a rebuilding in the late 16th century, drawn in an extremely ambiguous way and called out in the list as new square works, which means nothing. It doesn't tell me what kind of material it is. I have no idea what new square works is. But in a publication by Walter Raleigh, that is often attributed to Thomas Digges, who was the engineer on this project, it was clear that Digges intended the pier to be built in stone. And that he was conferred with in 1584 about what type of stone to use in building these jetties. So I'm assuming that Dover is built in stone at this point. I go look for a new image of Dover built in stone, but what I find is a 19th century image of Dover looking very much like timber. And that's confirmed by both Ash and Skempton. Ash saying there was a conflict about materials, Skempton saying no, in the end they finally built it in timber, not in stone. So Dover is not our source of inspiration for Carrick Ferguson being built in stone. So I go back to Carrick Ferguson, I go back to the town atlas. So Arthur Chichester arrives at the beginning of the 17th century as governor. Chichester was a mariner, so he knows harbors. He was also had an estate in Barnstaple in Devon, which is immediately adjacent to Clovelly. And Clovelly's been in my radar for quite a long time for different reasons, but it was built in stone in 1560 of big boulders. And that new pier, now old pier, in Carrick Fergus, built 1627, is largely composed of boulders on the outside. So Chichester doesn't make it to 1627. His brother Edward does. But we know that Chichester intended to rebuild this pier because he passed a decree that everyone buying some goods had to pay towards the making of the new quay. So Chichester had in mind that this was going to be rebuilt. He certainly would have known about Clovelly, and this might be how the technology transfers. Except that when I look at Clovelly, it looks mortared. It looks like something that's always been mortared. And when I look closely at that pier in Carrick Fergus, that's unmortared big boulders, 3 courses of big unmortared boulders. Which brings me back to Brady, because that's the exact description of Newhaven from Brady. Now I'm wondering if, in fact, Newhaven influenced Carrick Fergus rather than the other way around. We know from the town atlas and from Muskimmin, which is a great resource, that there was fishing trade between those places. We also know that this quay was destroyed in 1750 and rebuilt, so that work, mortared work above, is probably the new work. So now, having gone full circle, I don't know who influenced who. And I don't know what to say about that down survey notation, except that it's that big, and I don't trust notations that big very much. When it comes to construction, it's possible that Newhaven was built in timber first. It was pretty common in the 16th century. But it's certainly not the structure that Brady and his colleagues described in that paper. What they described was a double stone walled pier with an infill of stone. which matches the 1627 rebuilding of Carrick Fergus. It also happens to match the base condition of two mid-18th century piers just down the road from Newhaven, Balbriggan and Skerries. Both use this technology. So it's a sort of Fingal technology. So the transfer in knowledge could have happened in either direction, but I'm now convinced that it was actually coasting traffic that transferred that knowledge. That's kind of my circular reasoning process when it comes to harbors and trying to figure out how they're built. The way I use the Irish Town Atlas for a person who's not actually interested in towns is because of the reliability of the scholarship, which people have said already, the clarity of the citations, the archival maps. Really important is the introduction to otherwise unknown sources. Miskimen actually had a whole lot more to say about that key than is actually in the Town Atlas, which was interesting. But most importantly, for me to understand how knowledge gets transferred, I actually do need to know how the town develops. Even though I'm not looking at the town, it affects the harbor development. But more important than that, I really need to understand the governance of the town. And the Irish Towns Atlas does both those things for me, which liberates my time to go work on the thing I really want to work on. So please do more along the coast. Thank you.
Due to the excellence of timekeeping by the two speakers, we have lots of time for discussion. So are there any questions? You can sit up here. I might just make one comment. I'll restrict myself to one comment about Carrick Fergus. There's one very big difference. There's a big difference between 1627 and 1589. In other words, by 1627, Carrick Fergus is looking inland. By 1627, more than that, there's a whole army of army engineers in Carrick Fergus who've just rebuilt the walls under Chichester's instructions and enlarged the town. So there's a group of masons there who are working with stone building, and so that may be part of the explanation. I'm never entirely sure why Carrick Fergus had a pier in the first place, because if you go to Belfast just down the line, there's no pier. You know, you don't, for that long Belfast loch, you don't need a pier.
I think it was really a breakwater, not a pier. Yeah. So, same with Newhaven. They were breakwaters. They were sheltering rather than being a place to land goods.
You can see, I mean, Derry certainly has a number of these, but you need them in Derry because of the speed of the river coming around. But the Placid, you know, you just anchor ships in Garmoil and bring them in very small boats, bring your goods in very small boats. So there's no real need for a pier there. So I never quite understood why there was a pier in Carrick Fergus, but there clearly was. And I rather suspect that, if my memory is right, and my memory may not be right, I think the survey of the voluntary works, Carew's survey of the voluntary works in 1611, talks about them thinking about rebuilding a pier in stone. And that's exactly the point when they're putting the new walls up.
Yeah, and I did read about the new walls being built in Carrick Fergus at that time in the Town Atlas. And I'm aware that Ireland becomes sort of awash with military engineers in the 17th century. It really does. But I have looked at all those engineers, and you know, of the 100 or so engineers in the 17th century that Rolf Lower documented, there were only 3 harbour proposals. They were all for Dublin. So they're not working on harbours, they're working on fortifications. And they were certainly working on the fortifications of Carrick Fergus at that time. And it's not clear to me that they can move easily between fortifications and piers. I mean, piers are a particular kind of structure. They're built differently from buildings. But they were building an embankment, a seawall embankment at that time. So there is knowledge of building in the water. So yes, could be.
In parallel to Elizabeth's suggestion about transmission of techniques and knowledge, and that is suggested by Roger Stalley, the medieval architectural historian, who has suggested that an important site for the transference of ideas and techniques was the quarry where the stone was obtained from, and that the people who chose the stone, started to dress it, would have exchanged ideas about how that stone could have been used, and that you might have got transmission of building design in the Middle Ages from one quarry to another through the quarrymen themselves. It's just a point he made, which I think is a parallel to what you're talking about.
Parallel, and certainly there's also a transfer of knowledge about how to use Roman cement with craftsmen at the same time. The reason I suspect the coasting traffic, is because of Clovelly. Because I was not looking at the other side of the Irish Sea until a relative on the other side of the Irish Sea sent me a postcard of Clovelly. And when I first looked at it, I thought it was one of the harbours I was looking at in Wexford. And I thought, why is it identical to the harbour in Wexford? Not identical, but so close. And that's when I started to think, people are coasting back and forth between these places, and somebody puts up a new pier, and they go, oh, wow, that's interesting, and they come back and say, we should do something like that. I think that's actually how it's happening. And yes, quarrymen would have an impact once the technology hits the shore, but it has to come to the shore first.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a quick observation for Brendan. I've done a fair bit of research and mapping for Limerick. Incidentally, my great-great-grandfather had a pub on the top of Pike's Bow, and his name was Michael Hayes. So I might need to look at John Hayes' will just to make sure there might be a familial interest. But I don't know if you know, obviously the 1907 sale of the Earl of Limerick's estate is actually replicated, as it actually preceded in 1823 by a sale map of his estate done by James and John Coffey. That's available in the Limerick Museum. I don't know if you're aware of that. And also that the extramural hornwork coming out of John's Gate actually is shown in the property boundaries at the rear of William Street in the 1840s and the 1870s map. And lastly, that the extant town wall at the other side of behind the Roundhouse, that doesn't line up with the town wall that was excavated by the milk market. So the Mungrett Gate would have jutted out, but access post the mid-17th century with the actual mural outworks, the actual route out of the town from Mungrett Gate would actually have gone up Playhouse Lane and up Pike's Bow. So Pike's Bow actually would have been the main egress point from the city that would join up with then Wickham Street, which would turn into Boherbue and out to Ballinacurra.
Just on the point regarding your family inheritance, one thing that did happen, which was curious, was that after Thomas Omalley inherited from John Hayes, he paid £100, which was a lot of money, to Hayes's relations. There is no explanation of why, and I don't have the document that backed it up, but I do have the records from the solicitor saying, you know, charging his fee for drawing up this payment. So whether he was paying off the relations or what, I don't know. One theory was that his mother had come up with the £100 to persuade Hayes to leave it to him, and this was the quid pro quo to keep things sweet with the rest of the Hayeses. So it's too late, I'm afraid, to put on any claims. But thank you for the other sources. That's interesting.
There may yet be. Yes.
There is a story, an ancient Gaelic story, that Carrick Ferguson was where Fergus left the lands of Ulster and went over to Scotland to form the Royal Scottish Line. Now, I don't know if that has links with Queen Elizabeth, because I think it's after that that the Scottish line takes over. But then she would be maybe trying to commemorate the origins of the royal lines through Carrick Ferguson. Maybe not. But is that Chichester? Was he the one that was in Ireland as Lord Chichester of Phoenix Park?
He was Lord Lieutenant. Yeah.
Is there one last question before we have our break? Yeah. Can you hold on until we produce a microphone for you?
Just the name Perry, I didn't quite catch where Perry came into the line.
Edmund Sexton Perry inherited that property through his mother's family. So Perry was his father, but his mother was a sexton, and that was where the name came from.
Okay, well, I think it's just 3:15, so we have time for our 15-minute break before we come back for the last session. So thank you both very much for two papers that have clearly stimulated a lot of debate, and I'm sure there will be more questions for you over the coffee. Okay, thanks very much.